The year 2010 marked a violent unraveling of the old continent as historical seams began to burst apart. Walking through the cold bureaucratic corridors of power in Brussels or Frankfurt revealed an atmosphere suffocated by unbearable tension. International headlines screamed alarms about the catastrophic and seemingly inevitable end of the grand project known as the European Union. Greece found itself engulfed in financial flames, exposing a tragic wreckage built upon inescapable debt and severe mismanagement. Spain watched helplessly as its real estate market evaporated into smoke, dragging the entire banking sector into a deep abyss. Italy, once an industrial titan, gasped desperately for air while facing a mountain of public debt piling higher every day. Financial markets acted as cruel judges of national fate, smelling fresh blood and turning predatory gazes toward the Eurozone. Amidst this absolute chaos, global attention shifted away from Paris and focused intensely on a single capital city, Berlin. The entire world asked just one anxious, nagging question: would Germany agree to foot the massive bill to bail out Europe? People everywhere wondered if German taxpayers would open their wallets to save a common currency that seemed destined to die. In that historic moment, Germany rose indisputably as the economic queen, serving as engine and paymaster for the continent. Chancellor Angela Merkel acted like a true leader, steering the volatile fate of Europe from her executive office in Berlin. Her political decisions held absolute power, capable of saving or destroying an entire national economy with a simple handwave. Panning the camera away from German dominance to the west revealed another power watching this disaster unfold with deep concern. France stood on the sidelines observing the collapse with a bitterness that mixed political impotence with deep historical regret. For centuries, France had always considered itself the diplomatic heart and the undisputed intellectual brain of the entire European continent. They viewed themselves as the indispensable architects of the European Union and the core power balancing the continent's scales. The French elite mistakenly thought they would lead through this crisis as an equal partner with an authoritative voice. Instead, Paris was stunned to horrifyingly realize they had no standing left to resist the Germans' imperial demands. French leaders were forced to fake smiles for cameras while accepting austerity measures that they deep down absolutely loathed. France had been reduced to a mere junior partner, a silent passenger in a car firmly driven by Berlin. But the bitterest irony that turns this into a true historical tragedy lies in one small, overlooked detail. France's helplessness wasn't the result of bad luck or because of unprovoked German aggression. It was the direct result of a trap that France had meticulously built with its own hands. It was a gilded cage designed decades ago to contain German power and shackle this giant. The goal was to tie them down so tight they could never rise to dominate Europe militarily or politically ever again. That cage was the euro, the common currency we know today, born to serve as political handcuffs. In a twist of fate that no one at the Élysée Palace foresaw, the plan backfired completely. France built the cage, pushed Germany inside, and then somehow locked itself in with the beast. Only then did they realize, when it was already too late, that the German economic beast was infinitely stronger than they were. To understand this catastrophic miscalculation, we can't just look at spreadsheets from the year 2010. We have to go back in time to a very specific, cold and terrifying moment in our recent history. Let's go back to November 9th, 1989, the fateful night that changed the world forever. That was the night the Berlin Wall fell, shattering the physical barrier between East and West. For the vast majority of the world, that moment was pure exploding joy and wild, unrestrained celebration. The images became iconic: young people in denim jackets climbing that hated concrete barrier in sheer ecstasy. We saw them smashing it with sledgehammers, families reuniting in tears, and the final collapse of the Iron Curtain. It seemed like the permanent end of the Cold War and the irreversible victory of freedom and democracy. But while champagne flowed and Berlin and New York celebrated the end of history, Paris was trembling. In the highest offices in Paris and London, the atmosphere wasn't a party, it was sheer panic. François Mitterrand, sitting in his office at the Élysée, wasn't celebrating. He was staring into the abyss of history. Mitterrand was a man of the old world, a survivor bearing the psychological scars of the Second World War. As a former prisoner of war, he understood in his bones the true nature of Europe's bloody historical cycle. Watching the images of cheering crowds in Berlin, his tired old eyes didn't see freedom or democracy. He saw the inevitable return of the oldest and most terrifying nightmare in the French psyche, a unified Germany. For over a century, France's foreign policy has revolved around one single, unbreakable rule of survival. France's very existence as a major power depended totally on keeping Germany weak, or at the very least kept permanently divided. A united Germany sitting right in the heart of Europe would create a power imbalance that was simply unacceptable. With a population way bigger than France and a superior industrial base, it was a straight-up existential threat. Secret diplomatic cables and private files from that winter now reveal the sheer panic in Paris. That secret fear was carefully hidden from the public, but behind closed doors, President Mitterrand was desperate. He was convinced that a united Germany would go right back to its dangerous old habit of domination. Ironically, France's socialist president wasn't the only one terrified by the rise of the German giant. Across the English Channel, his biggest ideological rival, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, shared the exact same fear. Britain's Iron Lady was actually in a state of even greater political insecurity and anxiety than the French president. Thatcher and Mitterrand were like polar opposites. She was a hardcore free market defender. He was a leftist socialist. They barely agreed on anything, but on the thorny issue of Germany, they suddenly became kindred spirits. In a legendary private meeting, Mitterrand confessed his worst nightmares about the future of Europe to Thatcher. He warned her that a united Germany might wield even more influence in Europe than Hitler had ever dreamed of. He wasn't talking about invading armies or tanks rolling across borders, but about an unstoppable economic gravity. Thatcher didn't need any convincing. She famously said, "We've beaten the Germans twice, and now they're back." Her paranoia ran so deep that rumor has it she carried around an old map of Europe from 1937. She'd pull it out in meetings, point to Silesia and Pomerania, and warn that those lands would be the next demands. The fear was so intense that France considered the unthinkable, reaching out to the Soviet Union to stop the unification. Mitterrand, the leader of a NATO country, was actually willing to conspire with the Soviet enemy just to keep Germany divided. He rushed to Kiev to meet Mikhail Gorbachev, trying to convince him to keep the Red Army in East Germany. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to freeze time, but the wheels of history refused to stop turning. The momentum was unstoppable. The German people demanded unity, and the United States under George Bush backed them all the way. The Soviet Union was just too broke and politically exhausted to stand in the way of freedom. By early 1990, Mitterrand bitterly realized that his strategy of obstruction had failed miserably. Germany was going to unite, and the old containment strategy of keeping them divided was dead. France needed a new plan fast, because if they couldn't stop Germany from becoming a giant, they had to tie it down. They needed to bind this new Germany so tightly to Europe that it could never go rogue again. Mitterrand summoned his closest advisors and mapped out a plan that was as bold as it was dangerous. He decided that the price for France's signature on the Unification Treaty would be nothing less than Germany's soul. He would demand that Germany give up the Deutsche Mark, their beloved national currency, and dissolve it into a common project. To understand why this was the weapon of choice, you have to understand that the mark wasn't just money. It was the secular religion of post-war Germany, the only symbol of pride allowed to exist after 1945. The Germans had lost their flag and their army, but the mark represented their economic miracle, stability, and hard work. More importantly, the Deutsche Mark was the dominant currency of Europe, giving the German central bank almost imperial power. The German central bank cared about exactly one thing: fighting inflation, no matter what it did to their neighbors. They didn't give a damn if France was suffering from unemployment, or if Italy was desperate to jumpstart their economy. When the German central bank raised interest rates, the rest of Europe had to blindly follow just to avoid a collapse. If France didn't obey Frankfurt, investors would dump the francs and buy the mark, sinking the French economy instantly. This reality totally humiliated Mitterrand right at the start of his presidency in 1981. He came to power with a radical socialist agenda, raising wages and nationalizing banks to chase prosperity. The market's reaction was brutal. Money flooded out of the country, running for the safety of Germany. In 1983, Mitterrand had to surrender, ditching his socialist dream and imposing harsh austerity measures. He realized then that as long as the Deutsche Mark existed, France would never truly be the master of its own destiny. And that is how the logic of the euro was born: dissolve the absolute power of the mark into a shared bank. The goal was to dilute Germany's power into a common pool where France could claw back its voting rights and vetoes. At the end of 1989, at the summit in Strasbourg, Mitterrand dropped his ultimate ultimatum. He implied to Helmut Kohl that if he wanted German reunification, the price tag was the single currency. Helmut Kohl, a giant of history, found himself trapped between a political dream and a harsh economic reality. He knew full well that the German people absolutely loathed the idea of giving up their beloved mark for some experiment. Polls back then showed nearly 70% of Germans were violently opposed to the idea. But Kohl made a historic decision. He sacrificed the mark on the altar of German political unity. However, and here's the crucial detail, France ignored. Kohl didn't just surrender unconditionally. He accepted the euro, yes, but he demanded the new currency be built on extremely strict German standards. The new European Central Bank had to be a carbon copy of the Bundesbank, independent and obsessed with stability. It was strictly forbidden from printing money to cover budget deficits, a cardinal sin in orthodox German economic thinking. Its only sacred and unchangeable mission was price stability. Never mind what happened to growth or jobs. To add a symbol of victory, Kohl insisted the headquarters couldn't be in Paris or Brussels, but had to be in Frankfurt. The new central bank sat right down the street, just a stone's throw from the old Bundesbank, sitting under its watchful shadow. Furthermore, the Germans demanded incredibly harsh entry standards known today as the famous Maastricht criteria. The law stated deficits couldn't exceed 3% and public debt couldn't top 60% of GDP. That 3% figure was actually scribbled on a napkin by a French official just because he thought it sounded about right. It was an arbitrary number, but the Germans took it and treated it like an inviolable religious commandment. Their goal was to ensure the southern nations didn't use Germany's credit card to go on a reckless spending spree. France agreed to all of this with arrogance, mixed with a misguided sense of historical destiny. The French elite believed rules were just paper, and that in the end politics would trump economics. They naively thought that, while Germans might write the rules, they would be the ones running the meetings. They were tragically wrong. When the euro launched in 1999, the trap didn't snap shut immediately. Actually, in the early 2000s, it looked like France had won, and their strategy was working. Germany was shouldering the massive costs of reunification, and their economy was stagnant and sick. Unemployment in Germany was sky high, and the country was mockingly called the sick man of Europe while France was growing. It seemed the master plan had succeeded, but Germany did what they do best: brutal, efficient reform. In 2003, Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder launched Agenda 2010, painful but effective reforms. They slashed benefits, loosened the labor market, and weakened the unions, an act of political suicide for Schroeder. For a whole decade, German workers saw real wages stagnate while productivity skyrocketed. While Germany tightened its belt, France did the exact opposite, adopting the famous 35-hour work week. Wages in France just kept rising steadily, and public spending ballooned out of control. The French government, feeling safe under the protective umbrella of the euro, didn't feel the urgent pressure to reform. And this is when the silent but deadly mechanism of the euro trap started eating away at France. Back in the day, if France lost competitiveness and goods got expensive, the solution was simple and quick. Just devalue the franc against the mark, making French wine and cars cheaper to regain balance. That was an essential economic pressure relief valve, but with the euro, that valve was welded shut and closed forever. France couldn't devalue its currency anymore and found itself stuck in the same rigid exchange rate with a highly efficient Germany. A massive gap opened up. German costs plummeted while France's kept rising with no end in sight. By 2008, labor costs in France had risen nearly 30% higher than in Germany. The euro acted like a cruel amplifier for Germany. The common currency was too weak a fantastic bargain for exports. If Germany was still using the mark, it would have skyrocketed in value, making goods expensive and choking off global sales. But the euro stayed cheap, thanks to the weaker economies in the south acting like a permanent subsidy. Companies like BMW or Siemens could flood the global market with high-quality products at unbeatable prices. For France, the situation was the exact opposite. The euro was too strong and became a tax burden on their exports. French companies were tied hands, unable to compete. They couldn't lower prices because their costs were sky high. The result was a slow-motion industrial bloodbath that completely decimated France's manufacturing base. Year after year, French factories shut their doors in droves, and their market share in the Eurozone just went into freefall. From the year 2000 to 2010, France's industrial power took a massive nosedive. Regions that used to be the pride of production turned into desolate graveyards, filled with nothing but rust and unemployment. Meanwhile, Germany turned into a global export machine, racking up trade surpluses so massive they were practically obscene. All that cash flooding into Germany didn't just sit there. It was lent right back down south to inflate massive bubbles. When the crisis hit in 2010, that brutal trap was finally laid bare for everyone to see. France had dreamed that the euro would make them co-leaders of Europe, but reality was a freezing cold wake-up call. Instead of leadership, this common currency stripped away every shred of economic sovereignty and wiggle room Paris had left. In crisis meetings, France walked in with high deficits and a weak economy, holding absolutely zero bargaining chips. Germany, with its overflowing coffers and rock-solid industry, called the shots and set the rules of the game. Those so-called European decisions Mitterrand dreamed of turned out to be German decisions, with a European label slapped on them. France did manage to tie Germany down, sure, but they forgot that when you're tied together, the stronger one drags the weaker. The political dream of controlling the economy shattered against an economic machine that actually controlled the politics. Mitterrand used to fear German soldiers crossing the Rhine, but he should have been afraid of the German accountants instead. He should have feared the Audis and Mercedes crossing the border duty-free, backed by a currency that was tailor-made for them. France dug a pit to bury Germany's ambitions, but then slipped and tumbled right into the bottom of it themselves. The political elite in Paris, too scared to admit defeat, hid behind smoke and mirrors. To cover up their decline, the French state borrowed up to its eyeballs just to maintain an illusion of prosperity. It's like a cancer patient on high-dose painkillers. You might feel okay for a bit, but the disease is still there. The illusion of French-German equality completely fell apart when the European sovereign debt crisis exploded. The so-called Franco-German engine was exposed as a diplomatic charade. There was only one driver at the wheel, Angela Merkel. President Nicolas Sarkozy was reduced to a desperate errand boy running to Berlin just to take orders and get rejected. At the Deauville summit in 2010, Sarkozy surrendered and accepted the German vision of punishment and austerity. But history had one last twist in store, an ultimate irony that turned this tragedy into a ticking time bomb. Germany thought they were safe imposing their harsh rules, but through the Target 2 system, they ended up trapping themselves. Berlin effectively lent the very countries they didn't trust a whopping 1 trillion euros with absolutely no decent collateral. If the euro collapsed tomorrow and France decided to walk away, that 1 trillion euros would vanish into thin air. German taxpayers would lose an amount equal to 30% of their GDP in the blink of an eye. It's a form of mutually assured destruction, keeping the system alive. Paris is trapped by economy. Germany by debt. Berlin can't let Paris fail because Paris owes them too much money. They're chained together in a deadly embrace. And let's not forget Italy, France's economic sister, whose stagnation is threatening to bring down the entire French banking system. We're looking at 3 possible futures: an unlikely leap toward a federal state, a long clinical death, or a chaotic breakup. The story of the euro teaches us that the deepest changes in a nation's destiny often come from boring technical decisions. François Mitterrand looked at the map of Europe and saw a geopolitical chessboard where he could win. He thought he could use the euro as a piece to checkmate the German king and secure French dominance, but he didn't realize that the euro wasn't a chess piece at all. It was a mirror reflecting a brutal reality. A mirror that stripped away all protection, forcing France to compete, exposed and vulnerable against the most efficient machine. France went to great lengths to build the trap and bait the hook, only for it to snap shut on them. Now the door has slammed shut, the key is in Berlin, and the rest of the world is moving on. That is the harsh reality of the Euro trap, a magnificent gilded cage that no one knows how to escape. If you found this historical breakdown valuable, go ahead and hit like to help spread the knowledge. And if you want to uncover more hidden economic mechanisms shaping our world, make sure to subscribe right now. History never truly ends. I'll catch you guys in the next analysis.